Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Gaming Democracy webinar. My name is Joseph Dunne-Howrie. I'm one of the investigators on the project, and I lead it with my colleague, Tom Drayton. Hello, Tom.
Hi, everyone. Really nice to see everybody, and really excited about this, the second of our series of webinars.
Indeed. So, I'd like to also say hello to our panel. Aurelien, hello.
Hello, thanks for having me here.
Pleasure. And Malaika. Hello, Malaika.
Hiya.
Hello. So, just to give you a quick overview of the plan for this evening. Tom and I are just going to give a very brief introduction to the project, and then we're going to give the background to this session. Aurelien and Malaika have been given some questions and themes to reflect on, and once Tom and I have finished speaking, they will each present for about 10 minutes on the theme of theatre and democracy. And after that, we will have a discussion, the four of us, and then I'll be handing over for questions. But do please make use of the chat if you want to talk to each other. And once we get into the Q&A portion, if you could use the Q&A button. So without further ado, I will start the presentation, and Aurelien and Malaika will introduce themselves once we get into their talks. So I will just start the presentation now. And this is being recorded, by the way. Oh, sorry, Zoom is doing that thing where it thinks I'm on two screens. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that as a full screen now. Should see the holding slide. If there's any problems, please do let me know, panel. Like I said, this is the set, as Tom said, this is the second webinar in the series. Gaming Democracy Project brings together scholars, artists and activists working in the fields of participatory theatre, new media, gaming, criminology and political science. The network is investigating how the far right's gamification of extremist politics is altering and infiltrating mainstream politics. And the project is also exploring how theatre and the arts can model new forms of democracy. There was a much longer and thorough introduction to the project in the previous webinar, and I will share the link, the YouTube link to that just after I finish this presentation. So if you want to, you can catch up with it there. So for tonight's webinar, we're talking about theatre and democracy. So just to give some background to this, democracies around the world have been beset by a series of crises since the 2008 crisis. Francis Fukuyama's argument that the end of the Cold War signified the end of history, with liberal free market democracies representing the optimal political system, has become discredited. Opposition to austerity, the reactionary populist right and the far right, alongside civil disobedience to demand governments take action against the climate crisis, have used what we can recognise just from these pictures as theatrical techniques. We can see this both in terms of the visual language the protesters are using, particularly with protests and movements such as Extinction Rebellion and Me Too, alongside the spectacle of rehearsing with networked forms of political organisation, which the Occupy protests exemplified. So, writing in a very different context, Stuart Hall argued that the left failed to defeat Thatcherism because it did not image, his word, image, an alternative vision of modernity that the public could shape through mass democratic participation. The protest movements of the 21st century can be read as seeds of new futures and attempts to image these futures, but they're obviously very nascent at the moment, or they have been for the past decade because of all the different crises we've been having to face. So we at Gaming Democracy submit that theatre and performance can also make a critical intervention in this field by acting as a space to help bring these futures into being through collaborative acts of imagination. And Tom will just give an overview of what we were talking about tonight.
Great, Joe. I think we can just see the sort of back end of the PowerPoint rather than the kind of slides.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Let me. Oh, hang on. So I will try that again. How's that looking? Is that better?
That's better. Perfect.
Right.
Yeah, really great to see everybody. Thank you so much, Joe, for that great introduction. And I do urge, if anybody wasn't able to attend the last webinar, to go sort of back and hear some of the great stuff that was brought up here. The idea about this is to bring people together and to have conversations, and it's really exciting to get these interdisciplinary things together. So Malaika and Aurelien have been given provocations on the theme of theatre and democracy in crisis. The idea is that they'll each talk for about 10 minutes, which they've had discussions together, and then sort of are going to present about those discussions individually. And then we'll go into a roundtable discussion where Malaika and Aurelien will reflect on how they've approached these issues from their different disciplinary perspectives and what interdisciplinary overlaps they see in each other's works. And then we'll go into a Q&A as well. It'd be really exciting to get everybody talking about that. And of course, the idea of the Gaming Democracy project, like I said, is to bring together scholars, artists and activists working in the fields of participatory theatre, new media, gaming, criminology and political science together. I think Joe's already talked about that in particular. So I think the idea is for us to make a start. Is that okay, Joe?
It's very okay. And I'll just quickly show the slide. Oh, so tech is absolutely failing me tonight. So those are some of the slides missed. So they're the images of the protest movements I was talking about. And there's the quote from the late, great Stuart Hall. Okay, but yes, without further ado, let's start. So either Aurelien or Malaika can go first. I can see Aurelien. So Aurelien, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you both for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'll start because that's the way we decided to go with Malaika, because I'll be giving the kind of more negative vision of one particular construction of the people, and Malaika will be giving us some more emancipatory ways to think about the construction of the people. My research background is on studying the mainstreaming of reactionary politics and the mainstreaming of far-right politics in particular. And a lot of my work lately has been reflecting upon the construction of the people, and I'm putting the people in inverted commas here because I would argue that there is no such thing as the pure people, that these people has to be constructed, and there's various ways to construct these people. And I think in a way, theatre and looking at it through theatre kind of helps us kind of understand all of these kind of things, and how quite often politics is a performance and is a simulacrum as well of what we call democracy with a capital D. So I'm really interested in exploring the myths here around the people and around how popular the far right is constructed and reactionary ideas are constructed and justified. So I've prepared a short presentation, which I'm going to try and share now. So hopefully you should be able to see my slides.
Perfect.
Yeah, cool, brilliant. So after we discussed our research with Malaika, we decided to focus on the construction of the people. And what I will talk about here is the reactionary construction of the people, while Malaika will be talking about more emancipatory forms, as I said. In a way, as I said, this relates to how democracy could be today understood as a simulacrum, and that can link obviously to theatre, performance, and so on, as both do require a suspension of disbelief, something I'll come to in my conclusion. So obviously, today, when we think about the people, we have to think about the people in the age of social media, in an age where the people has unprecedented access to public discourse for many. The web, indeed, the internet, social media, they have offered unprecedented access to public speech for many, from progressive forces, of course. We could think of Black Lives Matter, we could think of the Me Too movement, to the most reactionary ones. And we could think here of Gamergate, or we could think about the QAnon movement and Trump supporters and those people who led the insurrection on the 6th of January 2021, sorry. Yet, while the web retains that air of democratic possibilities and almost anarchic structuring, it remains deeply unequal, a deeply unequal space that's dominated by the same conservative hegemonic ideas. And of course, one of the examples that we can think of that's quite timely at the moment is Elon Musk and his understanding of politics, as if the center had moved somehow to the left, while in fact, if you look at it by any kind of understanding of power and the way power works, we could argue that it's the opposite. And it's quite interesting here how the conservative figure in Elon Musk's drawing appears as like some kind of rebel saying lol in the bottom scale. And I'll come back to this in a second. And therefore, what I argue is that the rise, albeit limited and precarious, of voices previously silenced on the progressive side of politics and society, so again, BLM, Me Too, and so on, has led to a perverse development whereby performing reaction has become held up as radical change, and the defense of oppressive hegemony appears to be somewhat counter-hegemonic. So the defense of actually privilege today appears to be somewhat radical, the way Elon Musk, for example, is portraying it in his tweet, or the way people on the right and far right are talking about free speech to defend the right to be racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and so on and so forth. So this links me to discussing very briefly media, social media, and the rise of so-called populism. Populism is a term that I'm very critical of in my research. I believe there's some good uses of it, but I also believe that it is used very often carelessly, and that it ends up lending legitimacy and popularity to movements which are not, in fact, particularly popular. So the internet and social media in particular have given a democratic veneer to reactionary ideas, which not only appear as radical and as alternatives to the increasingly despised hegemony, as I said before, even though they are deeply tied to it, but it also can allow them to pretend that they represent a silent majority that finds a voice on the internet. We could think of trolls here. We could think of the way various reactionary figures claim to be representing that silent majority, and there's Trump obviously here. In this, the right has been generally, I think, and we can discuss that in the discussion and the Q&A. I think the right has been better, and the far right in particular has been better to harness the power of these new forms of discourse and platforms. Think about memes, for example. Think about kind of the trolling power and the way they can shut down debates and yet try to appear as radical while defending, as I said, reactionary hegemonic ideas. With this is the case in wider politics, of course. In advanced democracies, the internet seems to represent a number of false alternatives and false equivalencies. False equivalencies in terms of creating equivalencies between the far right and the far left, both being portrayed as just as dangerous to the kind of middle ground, as if the middle ground did not have porous borders that allowed radical ideas from both the left and right to vie for position, but also between some debates which should not really be had in 2022 and in the 21st century, debates between fascism and anti-fascism, and whether they are both they are good people on both sides, as Trump said after the Charlottesville event and the murder of an anti-fascist protester by a fascist protester. Debates between racism and anti-racism, and whether anti-racism is in fact the new racism, as we hear on conservative platforms increasingly. Debates between transphobia and transphobic people and the very lives of trans people. And debates between, of course, climate change and climate skepticism, as we've seen for a very long time on the BBC. And you can think of many of these false equivalencies, which are not helping democratic debate. They are skewing us away, actually, from proper democratic discussions. There are also the creation of false alternatives, such as danger is on both sides, and the status quo must be upheld, if only to prevent worse, generally the far right, from acquiring power. And yet, what's quite incredible about all of this is that, of course, the far right and people like Farage and Trump are portrayed as dangers to democracy and dangers to the status quo, but they're also constructed as the threat to the status quo, and that serves the status quo to present himself as somewhat somewhat the opposition to the kind of nasty far right. And I'm just going to start with a quote here and by Nigel Farage, which is in 2016, just after the Brexit vote and just before the election of Donald Trump. And Farage said in the Telegraph, which again shows that he's hardly a rebel because he has access to mainstream platforms very easily. And this is what he said, and I quote, "The similarities between the different sides in this election are very like our own recent battle. As the rich get richer and big companies dominate the global economy, voters all across the West are being left behind. The blue-collar workers in the valleys of South Wales, angry with Chinese steel dumping, voted Brexit in their droves. In the American Rust Belt, traditional manufacturing industries have declined, and it is to these people that Trump speaks very effectively." Of course, it's not just Farage who said that he represented the left behind, the working class, the Rust Belt and all of these kind of things. It's Donald Trump, obviously, but it's also much of the mainstream media which accepted that narrative that the far right somehow was speaking for the kind of left behind, the losers, the rednecks, the hillbillies, all of these kind of things, right? There's been lots of books that have been incredibly popular that have been published on these kind of ideas. Of course, all of this was built on it's a complete simulacrum. That doesn't exist, actually. There's no data that supports the fact that either Brexit or Trump were elected or were pushed through by the working class, whether white or not. This construction of a working class is a complete fantasy. But it's a fantasy that is a useful one because it allows the mainstream elite to actually blame the rise on monsters like Trump or like Farage or like Brexit onto uneducated people, onto poor people, onto people who are not them, who are not us, who are not the middle class, the educated, the wealthy, and so on. And, this is quite interesting because, again, we tend to blame reactionary politics onto the people these days, not just onto con artists like Trump, like Farage, and so on, not onto the media that talks too much about immigration and about the pet issues of the far right, but onto the people. And so therefore, what I try to do with my research is to show that we are faced in a way with a chicken or egg situation, and that we need to ask ourselves two key questions if we really want to understand what is happening on the stage of politics at the moment. Is the process far right driven or is it mainstream driven? And is the process people driven or is it elite driven? And what I argue in my research is that it is mostly mainstream driven and that it is mostly elite driven as well. And the widespread misuse of the people in support of the far right has a severe impact on the rise of the far right and on legitimizing the far right. Rather than reflecting the people, their misuse risks legitimizing so-called populist politics, which are not only dangerous to minorities and more emancipatory forms of democracy, but also divert attention away from other democratic crises. A wider study that I've conducted recently, which will be published soon, hopefully, finds that the people can be misrepresented in four principal ways through these narratives, which can unfortunately be only touched upon here briefly in this format. And let me know if I'm running out of time as well, and I can go quicker through them. The first one is a people to be followed. It gives the impression that anyone can listen to what the people want at any time through opinion polling, through elections, and so on, but also that anyone listening to opinion polling is thus listening to the people and following their lead, rather than pushing a particular political agenda. It creates the people to be blamed. The misuse of public opinion, for example, again, can risk creating a people to be blamed for the rise of politics the elite pretends to oppose, even though the elite sets the agenda. It creates a people to legitimize reactionary and elitist discourse and politics. The people here, again, through the misuse of public opinion of Trump as the representative of the people, is not simply blamed for the rise of reactionary politics. It is also used to legitimize such reactionary politics and often elitist stances, whether inadvertently or not. And finally, a circumscribed people. The people who voted for Trump and who pushed Trump in power were actually only 25% of the registered voters in the United States. Of course, as you may already know, the United States has massive issues of voter deregistration. The people who have been deregistered over the years in the United States are people who tend to be poorer, who tend to be of ethnic minorities, and so on and so forth. So all these people are not represented. The people who push Trump to power are a minority, and they're generally a wealthy minority. And yet we are told that they are the left behind, giving Trump some kind of democratic legitimacy. So to conclude, what I would argue is that all of this has been facilitated by the consolidation of narratives that allowed the mainstream to portray itself as self-righteous without having to challenge deeper structures of oppressions. The myths of unstoppable progress, of the irresistible move towards post-racial, post-sexist, post-homophobic societies whereby reaction is extraordinary and individualized, have prevented a real confrontation of a reaction still rooted in our current liberal hegemony. This has led to the concealment of top-down processes. What can we do as discursive elite if that is what the people want? We must follow what they want, even though we disagree with them. And what I would argue is that actually, as Rancia noted, all of this creates this kind of simulacrum of democracy that I've mentioned earlier. And Rancia talked about this a lot in the 2000s. He didn't use the word simulacrum, but what he argued is that we do not live in democracies, even though we do believe, or we keep saying that we do. We live in what he calls states of oligarchic laws, and that in fact, the hatred of democracy from our elite concealed by constructing the people as reactionary and needing to be protected from themselves, allows the perpetuation of a less than satisfactory status quo to protect the people, that if you let the people lose, we would have reactionary politics. So in a way, it's self-perpetuating. The creation of the far right supported by the people serves to support the hegemony in place, as if we let the people loose, they would choose the far right, even though this doesn't seem to be supported by any data. Anyway, I feel that it was maybe all quite muddled, but we can flesh it out during the discussion afterwards.
Not at all, Aurelien. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. There's so much to unpack there. Malaika, if we could go straight into your presentation, please. And just before you start, if you could just tell us sort of where you come at this from and just a little bit about your background, that'd be wonderful.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much. We've had a brief conversation already, but I've made so many notes from your presentation. So yeah, thank you for that. So my name's Malaika. I am a practice researcher at Arts Admin, which is an arts organisation in London. And I also work with a theatre and interactive arts company in Sheffield called the Bear Project. So hopefully you can see my slides. Do shout at me in the chat if that's not working. I'll just get my notes up. Cool. So what I've been exploring through my research and through my theatre practice for a number of years is how we might create more reflective, imaginative, and pluralist spaces for political discourse through participatory theatre. So normally my work takes place offline, but like many of us during the pandemic, they've kind of begun to bleed further into online spaces. So Aurelien and I thought it would be useful for me to take a more positive view of a creation of the people. So kind of on the other side of the coin from what he was discussing with this kind of reactionary creation of a people. At the heart of this idea for me in my work has been kind of Hannah Arendt's work around maybe an understanding of a common or a public sphere which exists kind of maybe beyond the individual and between the collective. She has this really lovely analogy of a table between the people. And I think that for the creation of that kind of space, we need reflective, imaginative, and pluralist opportunities for political discourse, which I would argue, probably agreeing with the previous presentation, that we largely lack those at the moment, both online and offline. I'm not going to go too far into theory in my presentation because I want to use most of my time to offer a bit of a case study from my own work with the Bear Project. So we created a piece during the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021, which attempted to create a collective and offer a different kind of space for political discourse between strangers all over the UK, mostly online. Okay, so, here we go. But because we kind of have to start from where we are, I'm very briefly going to sit with the negative, sit with the trouble for a moment, and just look at two issues that I just want to draw out with the current systems of political discourse that are particularly pertinent to like online political discourse, and also which I think could be usefully addressed by participatory theatre methods. So the first issue is maybe what I'd call adversarial listening or interruptive listening, which is pretty harmful to political discourse. That is a style of listening which is quite common in political spaces, where participants kind of use the time that the other person is speaking to reload their verbal gun, or politicians are rehearsing party lines and are encouraged to kind of follow a script rather than respond considerately to what they're hearing. And this is, I would say, like kind of baked into the way we do political discourse in the UK and beyond as well. That debate and conversation are kind of there to be won rather than learned from. It's like there even in the architecture of the House of Commons, right? And I think that within online political discourse, you know, we're already rehearsed in this in offline spaces and it's replicated online, but with more anonymity, with smaller time slots and smaller word counts, so that our ability to engage with complexity or nuance is kind of further hampered. So I would argue that this kind of creates a like horrible feedback loop between a flawed system that existed already offline and then is kind of hyper enhanced online and back and forth and back and forth. And then the second issue that I just wanted to briefly touch on is maybe the limited modes of like acceptable political discourse, like what counts as legitimate. So Iris Marion Young writes on this in relation to participatory democracy, that we require, if we really are serious about plurality within political communication, we need multiple modes of communication. And I think obviously art has a role to play there, that can, and I would argue as well that like the modes of political discourse that we currently kind of cling on to are based on outdated, like sexist, classist, racist ideas of what real legitimate political expression looks like. And that artistic forms have maybe a lot to do to kind of challenge that. Okay, so now on to the art, on to the positive side, hopefully, here. So this is, what I'm going to talk about today is one iteration of a project we've been working on since 2019 called the People's Palace of Possibility. So during the pandemic, the form changed from a live event into a piece performed over a number of weeks through a series of interactions in the form of like postal objects, telephone calls, and online exchanges. And through these interactions, a story is told, and the audience were invited to join an underground movement of palace citizens, which are a network of rebels who dare to imagine that other worlds are possible in a society that deems alternatives to the status quo naive and dangerous. So the letters give clues in which the audience finds an interactive website called the Palace Archive, which contains some expositional videos, as well as contributions from former palace citizens on their fears or their visions for other worlds. Within a few days, however, this black letter arrives, and black letters are never a good sign. So it's from the ruling party, announcing that those who have been associated with the palace have been arrested, and instructs the recipient to immediately destroy any similar correspondence inciting disharmonious activity. So after this, a final package arrives, hand-delivered, slightly muddy, and you can see that here in the For Dennis image, with only a first name hurriedly written across the front. And inside are a series of objects that enable participants to make rebellious interventions of their own in their own neighborhoods. And there's an audio guide which facilitates a walk in which participants are invited to perform tiny utopian acts of resistance, chalks on pavements, posting up posters, and also to reflect on a series of questions like, what do you daydream about? What makes you feel part of a collective? So photos are taken on the walk as well, and audio recordings of responses to these questions that have been asked are later uploaded to an ever-growing palace archive. So these audio recordings, I think, are very quite a moving reflection of the state of the world, what gives us hope, how we connect to each other. Some participants recorded poems, some were recorded in other languages, and then we kind of asked other Palace citizens to translate them for us. I don't have time to play you any now, but the link is up on this slide here if you want to explore the hundreds of contributions that we got from roughly 600 people across the UK between 2020 and 2021. So we worked with a PhD researcher from Keele University on this project, who did some interviews with participants that had taken part. And I just wanted to highlight one response that felt really relevant to our conversation today from one of the Palace citizens from Stockton-on-Tees. And I'm just gonna read it out here. It's a bit longer than what's on the screen now. So, all the different audio diaries and things were quite interesting. It was interesting for what the project was trying to do, which I think was to have a conversation about politics, because it's a bit fractured at the moment with all your different echo chambers and who you follow on different social media sites. So it was quite interesting to see what people were actually thinking about and what they wanted to change after the pandemic, just to see how other people were managing and coping with things. Because I suppose, well, I'm trying to spend less time on traditional social media, I suppose you would call it. So the likes of Twitter and Facebook and things. And sometimes it gets a bit noisy. But this seemed like a step back from that and more of a conversation about what people were actually thinking about going forward. So I think that there's maybe space for a bit of hope in that statement and in the data that's been collected by this PhD student that looks at this storytelling and these kind of slower interactions and more reflective approaches and playful approaches as well to political discourse, maybe offering us an opportunity to model something that's arguably more useful, more pluralist, more reflective than the current kind of adversarial model that we have. Of course, it has lots of limitations, which I'd be very happy to go into in the discussion. I'm not saying that this piece is going to solve democracy, but yeah, I just thought it would be an interesting case study on maybe how participatory theatre could potentially model an alternative. Yeah. Sharing there.
Thank you, Malaika. Fantastic. And just want to concur with someone who's written in the chat. This is really fucking cool. It is really fucking cool. That was great for both of you. So much to unpack there. I've just made some very sort of hurried notes. So I just want to, I think, just go back to what Aurelien was talking about, but obviously linked with Malaika's around the individual and this idea of the collective, and how in the kind of the sort of, I don't want to use the words, but culture wars, cancel culture, free speech, so-called debate, individualism is just put front and center, and to a kind of absurd degree. Where there's no any talk about obligations or even empathy has just become so discredited, and then they'll just chuck Voltaire at you as if that's an answer to anything. But I wonder if I'm just thinking now about this lovely the Palace project and participation and this sense of becoming part of something greater, but also that lacks a solid identity, something that's a little bit more fluid. I wonder if, and this could be for either of you, do we have to revise our idea of the individual, and perhaps not even so much individualism with its kind of Thatcherite overtones, but the classic liberal idea of individual freedom, if we're going to address all of these complex, what feel like intractable problems. So that's over to anyone. Start with that, please.
Malaika, do you want to go first or no? Okay. Well, that's a big question. First I want to say I totally agree with a comment as well about this is such a cool project, Malaika. And it made me think a lot as well. And interestingly, it made me think a lot along the lines of your question. But I don't think I have completely kind of phrased what I want to say about it yet. But I'll give it a shot. I mean, the individual and the collective, I think, is an interesting one, because I think, again, it points to the way we have accepted the discourse of reactionaries on this, because they're claiming that they're about the individual, but actually they're not. I mean, you could think about two very kind of things that I was reading about today, two very kind of very timely reactionary movements that we're witnessing in our society. Look at the United States, and the attempt to repeal the Roe versus Wade, and how this is against the individual rights of people to do whatever they want with their body. If you look at the transphobia that is everywhere, from the reactionary right to the mainstream, both right and even left to some extent, again, this is deeply anti-individual, like it's against people doing what they want with their own bodies. So I think we have this idea that, and that's where I think, I mean, a lot of my work has been on looking at this kind of construction of liberalism as a good, and progress as inevitable, which of course now we're realizing in 2022 that maybe progress is not inevitable, it's not irresistible, we just don't have to wait to have gender parity, gender equality, all of these kind of things, that we've been promised, and we just had to be patient in a way. And now finally we seem to be realizing that maybe that's not the case. And actually, even though we're realizing that, you mentioned the end of history at the beginning of the talk, Joseph, and this idea of the end of history has been debunked a long time ago. Even Fukuyama stopped believing in it a long time ago, and yet it grips our society. This idea that somehow we're all liberals, that liberal democracy is amazing, that liberal democracy has given us all these rights. Well, in fact, all the kind of great rights that we have today and that are under threat were not won thanks to liberal democracy and the liberal elite. They were won against them. Think about the rights of women to vote. Think about the rights of LGBTQ communities to do what they want, to be free. Think about the civil rights movements, all of these kind of things. This was not given away by the liberal elite because it was written in the liberal kind of coda or something like that, or in the liberal book of laws or something like that. It was won against the liberal elite, and it can be taken away very quickly. And that's what we're seeing at this stage. And I think what we need to do is move away from these kind of fantasies of the hegemony being somewhat good to us, while in fact it's never been good to us, and it's never been about individualism. It's always been about the individualism of those at the top. And just to finish on that, because I don't want to take too much time, and I already feel that I have, but Malaika's talk about plurality, I think, and openness was fascinating, because it kind of like went in complete opposition to what I was talking about, which is great, because that's what we created that talk for, about, today, the way free speech, for example, is used. Free speech is used by people, and it used to be a progressive thing. And in some contexts, free speech is still progressive, of course. People who are in shackles, for example, people who were under colonization, free speech was incredibly important. But today, the people who claim free speech are actually people who don't want that plurality. They don't want that openness. They want the right to be racist, to be sexist, to be homophobic, to be transphobic, and so on and so forth. So in fact, again, what is portrayed as somewhat democratic, somewhat progressive, or what is stealing words that used to be democratic and progressive, is in fact pushing this kind of reactionary movements. And we need to be much better at countering these fantasies, I think. And I think we've failed. We've been far too comfortable, I think, on the left, with things that are just blatant lies and that are just counterproductive for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think, there's this interesting thing, maybe particularly around like when we think about individualism, and how that's kind of always been heralded as like a property of the right, but that actually that's been like massively undermined by the right in loads and loads of instances, and that actually, freedom of speech and plurality. And I kind of want to like dive into there, because I feel like this could go in any number of directions, and like that's the thing that I want to focus on.
You're here for it. Come on.
Just to remind myself. So Hannah Arendt, when she was writing, she was writing against totalitarianism, like in the wake of World War II, right? And she was writing against like the rise of populism, but in a way that was like so completely different to the kind of birth of neoliberalism that was happening at that same time. And I think that the key way that she did that was to like hold on to plurality more than anything else, that to say that in order for us to live collectively in a democracy, we need to recognize the value of disagreement and listening to alternative views. And I think that the way that free speech has been weaponized is actually by kind of claiming the right to silence others in a weird kind of way. Like, I think that there's some really interesting work that's kind of comes from feminist theory about free speech and silencing. Ray Langton's like a great theorist on this, but she talks about how if your speech act essentially renders like other people in the space unable to speak with validity, and maybe this comes down to like legitimate forms of political discourse again, like if a racist is there and allowed to speak and kind of say like, well, Black people don't have the intellect to engage in this conversation, then that effectively silences that next person who's like there to speak. So I think that when we're thinking about political discourse and holding multiple views in the room, we also have to be careful around where the lines are. And maybe that's what the conversation should be. It shouldn't be free speech or no free speech, because obviously that's a false binary. Like, how do we create spaces that are safe for everybody to speak and be heard, and create spaces that where we're allowed to listen? And I think that the creation of a collective is crucial to that, to like say, rather than the question being when we come to the table, fascism or not fascism, trans rights or not trans rights, like what if the conversation was, how do you want the world to be better? How could your street be better? Like, how could, more people in your community have access to healthy, good food? Like, these are the questions that we should be asking. And that's what like democratic spaces need to facilitate and create opportunities for, in a way that is inclusive and useful, actually useful, rather than just about winning the political discourse, which is currently kind of what we seem to do mostly.
Aurelien, you got your hand up.
Yeah, if I can jump in, because I mean it's such a great kind of topic to think about, I think, along these lines as well. But I think what fascinates me as well is like in these, it's so obvious, right? It is so obvious the kind of discussions we should be having about having better futures and things like that, and instead we have debates with, on the one hand, people who are just asking for basic equal rights quite often, or the right to survival if you think of climate change, and then people who are denying the humanity or the future humanity of groups of people. And it's like, really, is this what an open debate is like, which is like, you don't exist or you shouldn't exist, versus can I have some equal rights? I mean, it's kind of mad, but this is nowadays the kind of basis for a free speech debate. And if you look at the number of platforms that people are given to be able to deny the humanity of other groups who are simply asking to exist, is madness. Well, instead of like, and it's completely filling up the space we have to discuss other alternatives and alternatives, not even other alternatives, because actually these discussions lead to no alternative, because there's no will to understand the other from reactionaries. They want to debate, they want all these things, but actually they don't want to discuss, they're not open to anything. They just want to push their ideas, right front and center. And
No, I'm trying to hold myself back, because this is such a kind of trigger for me, the whole free speech stuff.
Come on, go on.
Well, no, I want to go into one, but I think that if anyone, I'm sure people here are familiar with the Academy of Ideas, and every year they put on something called the Battle of Ideas. It's the most, this kind of, even the name is just so annoying, just like, can't you just call it a conference? Like, it's the Battle of Ideas, which is in the Barbican, so it's obviously tickets are 75 quid up, and so instantly you're excluding a huge mass of people who can't go there, and the sessions are just crazy. It's 4 people, all of whom are agreeing with each other, saying that the problem is we're being censored. The problem is that our views aren't getting heard. The problem is that students are all snowflakes. The problem is people don't know how to debate. And it's kind of like, it's very weird. I've looked at them for years. I have become a bit obsessed. These weird Trotskyist, libertarian, neo-reactionaries fascist sympathizers, and I'm not exaggerating there. Like, the history of this group, we have not got time into. It's very complex. In the 90s, they were denying genocide in the Balkans. They were supporting the IRA. Now Claire Fox, one of their leaders, has got a seat in the House of Lords. Thank you, Brexit. That's what it's done. Completely completely shook up the centre, I guess. What was, and even if we accept that the centre is a simulation of real politics, but I'm interested in this idea of how the right are now performing being censored. That seems to be the debate. That I'm being censored, and to the point where the Spectator will carry transphobic articles every week, but never once even considers, even in a tokenistic way, us trans person to write an article as a rebuttal. So you create this real loud activity of censorship without any material, concrete examples. And I think it's been a while since I read Hannah Arendt, but I think she talks about that, the kind of when politics ceases to be about what we can see and feel and the senses, then it becomes pure ideology. Then people are swept up in stories, and all they have is the collective, to fall back on, because they're material conditioned, and that's the prison to experience things by. So that was my, so just following that, and I've just got a note here around this idea of adversarial / interruptive listening, which I love. I think that's such a lovely frame for what it's like to do politics on social media. But then what kind of spaces then do we need to create that alternatives? Because I agree with you, Malaika, that there should be a line, and that it is not just free speech for all. It is, we have to speak from, we have to realize that speech is performative, right? Speech has consequences, material actions in the real world. So are the mainstream formats no longer useful? The Oxford Union, political interviews, have they reached their limits? And if they have, where should we be looking for new forms? And is the internet, is there any potential on the internet for these new forms to be experimented with, at least?
Or performance. I'm going to chuck that in there as well, Joe.
Yes, of course. Yeah, good old theatre. Yeah, sorry, that's who I am.
Yeah,
and theatre, of course.
So obviously I think that art spaces do have a role to play, particularly in that like plurality of modes of communication that Iris Marion Young speaks about. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that like our current modes are like we should just throw them out completely. I just think that they shouldn't be the only modes. That this plurality of modes of discourse maybe does include that kind of Oxford style debate, but it's like it doesn't need to be the only form of legitimate discourse. Actually, Marat Hammond, who's a political theorist who writes quite a lot on environmental policy, talks about this kind of hopeful rise at the moment in like participatory forms of governance, like citizens' assemblies and mini publics and things like that, citizens' juries, participatory budgeting. Like, I think that there's a lot of examples out there, and it's like, can we find a groundswell? And I think that participatory budgeting, for example, has been done online. I think that online tools are not divorced from offline tools, right? And if we have useful good, I mean, obviously those are normative words, right? But like, if we have tools offline that genuinely enhance plurality, that genuinely make space for reflection and imagination, though of course the internet can be helpful, but right now we're just replicating shit structures on like platforms that just like hyperact them. So yeah, I think it's recognizing that so a lot of my work is inspired by Eric Olin Wright, who's an American sociologist, and his work on real utopias. And he has this idea that there are already lots of like hopeful things that are happening in the world that kind of challenge the harmful systems that we live in different ways. And if we celebrate them and highlight them and connect them together, then we can create the fissures to bring down the shitty systems that we live under. And I'm a great believer in that. And I think participatory theatre is definitely one hopeful shard of light. with its many flaws, they're real utopias, they're not flawless. And participatory budgeting is another one completely that I know a lot less about. And citizens' assemblies are one as well. And like, I think that maybe there's room for hope. We just need to like find these experiments and like push them forward and amplify them and replicate them and learn from them.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if I'll just jump in briefly, because I think Malaika said everything far better than I could on this, but I think, yeah, there's always this question about the internet being good or bad. And it's just a tool that could be either, right? But I think you're right. And like when you say that we're just replicating the same things and make them worse almost on the internet, but it doesn't have to be this way, right? It's all contingent again. And I think we need to really think about, like we really need to rethink the way we look at politics on the left broadly, and both culturally and everything like that, and start imagining, like at the moment we are reacting far too much. We're reacting to reaction, and we're no longer acting almost. We're no longer kind of acting and moving forward and imagining new ways, as if everything had been exhausted. Again, it goes back to the way we are still gripped by this idea of the end of history. And we're not imagining new futures. That's why I liked when you were talking about utopias earlier, utopian acts of resistance. I think I quite like that, because it's not just resistance, it's also utopian. It's also, there's this process of imagination, of thinking about new ways, not just trying to save the old, regardless of how good it is and regardless of how it needs to be saved, but also to think about new ways forward. And I think we've given up on that because there are various urgencies we need to, or things that are urgent that we need to respond to and to react against. But I think we need to think a bit more in a more utopian ways. And I think arts here and theatre can help us, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and totally just reclaiming that word as an ideal, not giving in to the fallacy that we have to live as though we already live in the world we're trying to create. I think that's what Naomi Klein said once. That was, we perfectly put it. That's always the accusation leveled at environmentalists, in particular. Like, do you drive a car? It's these stupid questions that just to try and catch people out. I'm aware there's been a bit of activity in the chat. So Tom,
shall I feed some in? I really like that sort of reaction to reactions, Aurelien. I think that's really sort of summed up everything going forward in terms of how politics is moving. It reminds me of the Bo Burnham lyric, the backlash to the backlash of the thing that's just begun, which I think is quite apt. And we've got some great, thank you everyone in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm just feeding in stuff in now. We've got some really good reactions to things. In the chat, we've got Pedro says, cool, we need to be mindful of usefulness, as pragmatism is often used as disguise for the right who claim to exist outside of ideology, which I think we kind of began to spoke to already. But also, I'd just like to bring in, through that as well, because we were talking about participatory theatre, we've got a question here from Hazel about how we could use participatory theatre to better the system and arts use together. But also I want to feed in with that. We've got 2 Q&As from Pedro, which I think are part of that as well. One about Malaika's project sounding really cool and plural, but who sets the questions or prompts in the box, which I'm also interested in. And then also about how is at least Aristotelian theatre not also adversarial? So how does theatre need to change, and how? So I wondered if Malaika, because of those questions, you could kind of speak a little bit more about that project, and particularly kind of who was involved and how, I suppose, as in that case.
Yeah, absolutely. Just also responding really briefly to that pragmatism question, because it, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And usefulness isn't, it's like, instead of saying like imaginative, reflective, plural, like every time, sometimes I just use useful, and I totally recognize that it can be kind of co-opted into pragmatism and this kind of Thatcherist idea that there is no alternative and we're beyond ideology. And actually that's really what the People's Palace of Possibility was reacting against. So thank you very much for bringing that point, that the kind of the dystopia that we created, the story, the world the story took place in, was with this kind of oppressive regime called the Consensus, who believed that the world could not be improved upon. Like we had reached the end of history, arguably, and that we were beyond ideology, and that any belief in alternative was completely naive. So we were kind of living in like a hyped up Thatcherist state in that world that really was, and that. So yeah, I agree with you. And then let me just remind myself of your actual questions. So who sets the questions? That's a really good offer. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a project we've been doing for a long time, and we've asked like a lot of different questions in it. Like the company sets the questions, but the questions are not issue specific, and they're not so we've tried to keep them very, very open. Like, what do you think the world will look like in 30 years time, or what do you daydream about, or what makes you feel part of a collective? So we're trying to aiming for these broad questions, but of course our own political perspective is going to come through, and even the words we use, right? Like how we offer these questions. And that's a limitation of, I think, any political space at all. Like if it is facilitated, then there's going to be like a little bit of a bias. But having said that, we kind of did two things to maybe like resist that a bit. And the first was how we invited people to take part. So we worked with the venues that were kind of helping us to put the show on, to reach into like communities they already had relationships with, but then each person that was invited to take part was invited to bring along somebody they had disagreed with in the past. So some people brought along their neighbors, other people brought along their mum, other people brought along one person brought their plumber, and so we actually, I think, had like, if you listen to some of the responses in the Palace archive, I don't think that it was just one political perspective. And I think that the questions maybe also being framed openly enough allowed people to kind of respond to what they were living in that moment. And I think that also really comes through in the archive, that one of the Palace, obviously there's a lot about lockdown because that's what people were living at that moment, but there was also one of the performances we ran was alongside the like Sarah Everard news story and the Kill the Bill, and suddenly like half of what we were getting in pictures and audio recordings was about like gender politics and like the rights of women. And so it was really interesting that people did find enough space in what we offered them to just talk about what they were feeling and thinking about in that moment. But yeah, absolutely, like I'm not claiming to be above bias. Like, of course, I'm going into the project, and even the way the project just frames it, you know, as anti-Thatcherist, like it comes with that baggage. So yeah.
That's
sorry if I just may. I mean, there is something kind of strange, but quite often we have to justify ourselves to defend what we believe in when it's kind of like, you know, I mean, discussions on the left, even on the radical left, are generally very open, right? Of course, not everyone is welcome to these spaces, but I think the people who are not welcome to these spaces are the people, again, who are, you know, denying the humanity of some. And I think we need to be far more kind of, we need to start believing in what we believe in, the way the right believes in what they believe in. And we always apologize. We always kind of like tend to be like, oh, well, you know, we're open-minded, we're open to everyone. I don't think we should be open to everyone. I think the people who deny the humanity of certain groups shouldn't be welcome in the spaces that we try to create, because again, they're against that plurality and that open-mindedness. And I don't think like having some strong beliefs in these kind of things doesn't mean that we're necessarily narrowing the possibilities. It means that we're actually finding a platform from which to build on, but we all can agree with at least a starting point. It doesn't mean that we end up with, like, we agree on the end point to it, but at least we agree on the starting point, and therefore we don't get into the Oxford type debates of people who come in having prepared to disagree with each other and refusing to budge. Instead, we start from that kind of these shared beliefs that are incredibly broad and wide, and then, you know, build the future, as opposed to kind of actually some people trying to defend the past that is clearly not working for most. So, yeah.
That's brilliant, Aurelien, and refreshing to hear in some ways. We've got another question from the chat. Arlo says, as a maker trying to create in this realm, I'd be curious to hear more about examples of work or writers that you've found as helpful references.
I always really struggle with that kind of question. I think like maybe this actually relates, it kind of speaks to that Aristotelian theatre question as well, that my kind of training and background in part has been in theatre of the oppressed and forum theatre, and Auguste Boal is somebody I kind of often reference, and I think that his work is maybe sitting in where we move beyond Aristotle in political theatre, like how do we activate the spectator into the spectator and invite them up on the stage to challenge the discourse that is happening on stage. I think other examples of this work maybe would be like Metis Arts, run by Zoe Svensson. That work is like kind of explicitly environmentally focused and was really inspiring. It was a case study that I used in my PhD a few years ago. And who else? Sarah Woods is doing really interesting work. Sarah Woods, she has worked with theatre of the oppressed methods in the past, but she's kind of like pushing her practice beyond that now to work with like literally citizens' assemblies and like policy making and using storytelling in policy making spaces. And Katie Rubin as well, who's been doing quite similar stuff like policy making using theatre practice type stuff. I don't know, Tom and Joseph, I feel like you guys will have some good references as well for this kind of stuff.
I mean, I'd recommend Malaika, really, to be honest, as a really good writer for this kind of stuff. She would know I go to. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I mean, Joe and his work with his colleagues on the Post-Immersive Manifesto as well kind of speaks to this kind of work that, you know, in terms of participation, moving towards something that can kind of engender empathy and a collective good, I suppose, rather than kind of a participatory theatre that's kind of being collected up by, you know, capitalist bigwigs and turned into profit making.
Dare we mention their names on a public webinar? But yeah, I mean, that was, I think, certainly Adam Alston's work on neoliberalism and participation. It's pretty foundational, and he's got this wonderful phrase, entrepreneurial participation, which describes everything that is not what we've spoken about. It's the difference between, would you like a packet of crisps or a can of Coke? It's that sense of, oh, look at this choice I have in this performance, and ultimately you're still left with junk food. Door A or door B, can I not create a door C? No, we're going to tell you how to participate in this work. So recommendations. I found David Runciman's How Democracy Ends useful in a kind of like hopeful-ish way that if we look for historical precedents of democracy ending, we're not there, and it sounds alarmist, but there are seeds of hope, and which are not just found in parliamentary systems. So that gives like, and there are also, and in part of that book, he does talk about our relationship with machines, and like how we have it, as has been said about the internet, we kind of pour all our hopes and dreams into technology that will solve things, and actually this will just create new problems ultimately, and as well as new possibilities as well. And he's got a great quote: "The machine lost, the machine won." Yes, it does everything that we wanted it to do at that historical moment. So again, in the sort of post-Cold War context, be a global community. Yes, we are more hyper-connected now, but out of that, new political, social tensions have arisen. And I guess a sort of a random, maybe a slightly random example or recommendation I'd give is the work of Adrian Howes. Just because in that kind of one-to-one work, in the wonderful book by Deirdre Headon and Dominic Johnson, I hope it's Dominic Johnson, isn't it? They just talk about, you know, just the sense of scale compared to the big immersive work. That's the first time the word immersive has been used, but this is kind of in the same field. The kind of the punch drunk world of you are in a complete, Narnia world. Whereas the one-on-one, it's incredibly small in terms of physical scale, but in terms of the complexities of the interactions that you're having in that one-to-one work, it's night and day, because you act as a collaborator, in the work. And I talk about this, and sorry for the plug. I talk about this in an article I've written called Network Audience Participation, not by Adrian Howes, but by two pieces called One Day Maybe by Dream Think Speak and Operation Black Antler, which was a collaboration between Blast Theory and Hydrocracker. And that piece blew my mind. I haven't got time to talk about it now, but it's the first time I've ever felt that audience participation, that I felt I was making an ethical choice, truly ethical. So see that there's quite a bit of chat.
Yeah. So Hazel's brought in a question about if we'd experimented with theatre on online platforms like End of All Meeting, and I think probably most people did see some or experiment with some sort of participatory theatre online in the last couple of years. So to what extent do you see a future possibility of improving or advancing participatory or applied theatre? And I take it that means sort of on an online platform or extending into a virtual space on that. That's a very good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I actually think that there's a lot to be said for live interactions. And I'm a bit resistant in my own practice to like moving too much online. Like obviously we did this version of the Palace online in part. We also had like a phone version where people could take part on over the phone, because we were really aware that some of the people that we were reaching out to didn't really have digital access or weren't comfortable in that medium. So we literally like sent people in the post like disposable cameras and spoke to them on the phone like in a very what's the word I'm looking for when it's like not digital, analog kind of way. So, and I think that there's something about the face-to-face, particularly with like applied and participatory practice, that I think that you do kind of need to be in the room. But then once you've been in the room and once you've had live interactions, I think then moving into more dispersed forms and online interactions in order to connect things together is really lovely. Because I think that particularly when we're thinking about international practice and building networks that exist across the country and across the world, like if we're going to connect together these like little utopian moments, we need to be using the internet, and we need to have those online spaces as well. So even with the Palace Archive, like the ambition is that this work moves to live, but that the Palace Archive grows with it, and that there's a really lovely recording actually in the archive where this woman talks about how when she looks at the things happening in her local community on her street, she feels a lot of hope about the future of the world, because she sees like, her neighbors doing these things, her friends doing these things to improve the place that they live. But when she thinks about the world on a global level, she feels like quite a lot of despair and dread and fear. And something about how maybe through the internet and through these maybe reflective and imaginative projects, if there is a way that we can connect together and build solidarity, to say there's hopeful things also happening in this town outside Barcelona, as well as in Sheffield, as well as in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Like, how can we build these frames that build solidarity across place? But I think that like fundamentally those projects in those places should have like quite a lot of offline relationality, because we just respond to people differently when we're there with them in real life, I think.
That's really interesting. Oh, sorry, Joe.
No, go on, Tom.
That's really interesting, Malaika, and really interesting in terms of in terms of how people can access these kind of things and who is able to engage with this kind of work, and in terms of digital access or that kind of thing, but also kind of I'm thinking about financial access issues, geographic access issues, even cultural access issues. You know, this kind of speaks to what in a way what Aurelien was saying about kind of who's in the space. What I'm interested in terms of Hazel's question, participatory theatre, particularly in the digital realm, is how people access this and who is excluded from these spaces in a way, in terms of not that we're excluding them because they're not going to engage in this, but in that they can't sort of don't have the ability to engage with these kinds of things. And I was doing a participatory workshop with some students elsewhere recently, and they're all very, very good at this kind of like empathetic, getting to know people, really, really lovely space, and came up with these great, great things. And it was this beautiful workshop. And I asked them about it afterwards, and one student goes, "This was great, but I wonder how my dad would engage with this." And that's the one thing that I keep coming back to is, you know, you do these works with, like I say, I always go back to this idea of either sort of artists clapping each other on the back or lefties clapping each other on the back. You know, how do you get people to engage in this that is that aren't used to these kinds of spaces in a way that is meaningful and that they can engage with as well, not being reductive about any audience members or that kind of thing. But I don't know if Malaika, in terms of your project in particular, that was something that was kind of at the back of your minds in terms of how you allow engagement from people who from various backgrounds, various knowledge of participatory theatre practices, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's also like there's a certain amount of like even like the tone of the piece, like this the storytelling angle, the puzzle angle. Like when we did it on with like a test audience, when we were like testing out the ideas, you know, we asked one of the makers' mum to do it, and she absolutely hated it because she just hates puzzles, and like she just didn't want to engage with it. She was confused, she was angry, she absolutely said no. So I don't know, I mean, with any of these things, right, there's going to be people in the room who just don't want to engage, but often it's like, I don't know, I mean, I think that that's also true of like these like far right groups, right? Like these are like incredibly insular, like online communities, like 4chan and 8chan and all of these spaces where these conspiracy theories are born. There's very few people who are like confident in that technology and confident to like be in those spaces as well. So if those are like fairly insular groups, like how do those stories then hit it out like beyond that space into the mainstream? Like why can't a story from the People's Palace of Possibility like hit the mainstream like QAnon does? Like what's the difference there? I don't know.
That's a perfect question for Aurelien, actually. How does the far right infiltrate the mainstream?
Well, I mean, how many hours do you have, right? No, but I mean, it is a great question, but I mean, it's, you know, and it's so, you know, I think you've put it very well. There's no good reason in a way, you know, because these ideas, in fact, and the ideas that you're talking about are probably shared by far more people, but they just, you know, there's the voyeurism of the media, there's our media ecosystem, there's our educational ecosystem as well. There's all of these kind of things that kind of play a part. And that's why, you know, I tend to see the mainstreaming of a far right as a top-down process rather than a bottom-up. You know, it's not what the people crave. You know, the people don't crave anti-immigration rhetoric or anti-immigration news, or, you know, it's what they're given. And, you know, they're given that, and that's what they get to. But the other thing that kind of made me think about other, you know, when you were saying about who we engage with, and I think Tom was talking about who we engage with as well, and, you know, we might just engage with kind of left-wing people. It's interesting again how, and it's like I've been saying, how we should kind of think forward as opposed to kind of keep that nostalgia going, but how we've lost a lot of the kind of community organization that we used to have in some left-wing circles, you know, a long time ago. And I'm always reminded by my my aunt in particular, who grew up so my dad kind of escaped fairly quickly and became middle class very quickly and lost complete interest into anything that would be arts, you know, philosophy, literature, or anything like that. So he would have been one of these people who wouldn't engage with any of his projects. But my aunt, who didn't have any formal education at all, was always kind of involved in the kind of like communist book clubs in France, where the Communist Party was really strong, and like people used to go, well, instead of going to kind of like daycare or whatever, you would go to the Communist book club and you would read Marx and you would read Lenin and all of these kind of things. And I reconnected with her a few years ago, not that long ago, and with her I can talk to philosophy about, she's read Jacques Rancière. She has a massive chip on her shoulder because she doesn't have that formal education, but is the only kind of form of education that we value today. But she would absolutely love the projects you were talking about before, right? Even though she is still, by all standards, incredibly working class. But I think that's where I think it's important, as you said, Tom, not to be reductive, but because again, it's kind of the systems that have made people have no that have prevented us from thinking beyond what we're given almost. So if you have access to these things from the beginning, or if you're trained to have access to these spaces and all that, you feel comfortable in them. And if you're not, then you just give up because that's just the way it is, and these people are just too far from me and I can't understand it and all of these kind of things. And instead what I'll do is just, accept what I'm given. And again, I think it's pointing out the contingency of all of it, pointing out that things haven't always been this way, that they don't have to be this way always either, that they can be wildly different, and we don't know where this is gonna lead us in a way. And I think that's where there are concepts that are interesting here to explore, like the leap of faith, the unknown, but all these kind of things that I think we've given up upon because we need that certainty. We need to know where we're going, and unfortunately where we're going is things that have been tried and tested and that are not working. Anyway, sorry, I went on massive digressions here, but yeah.
No, it's not, because you've actually put me in mind of something we talk about in the Post-Immersive Manifesto, which I think is a nice and important link between sort of participatory theatre and wider politics. Is like knowing what's the offer, what's the rules of the engagement here, and so much that we criticise in that text that it's built for a middle class audience that can afford to keep spending £100 a ticket. Oh yeah, I know what we have to do. I get this. Whereas if you are put in a situation which is completely unfamiliar to you, it's very alienating. And there's definitely a massive class issue here around, as there always is in terms of theatre pricing. But I wonder if this is just a fault. It doesn't have to talk about it, but in terms of we're talking about the kind of formats of legitimate political discourse. I mean, people look at LBC at a phone in. I know exactly what I'm looking at there. I know exactly what the rules are. James O'Brien will put this on Twitter, and we know this. And Nick Ferrari's on Oxford Union debate. We understand it, and because we're saturated with these forms, maybe it's not about so much creating completely alternative spaces, but trying to create new modes of engagement in those spaces to disrupt them. I just noticed that the chat has really gone lively. So we've got 8 minutes. So Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, we can go into a couple of things here. Thanks everyone for your messages. We've got Ian's come in saying, but Tom, isn't there a sense that not everyone has to be or will want to be involved? I think that's yes, definitely really important. Which is my problem with citizen panels. There are some being run here in Cumbria about climate change issues, but it seems to give a small group of people a sense of self-righteousness, whereas the basis was more about broader education and advocating in each one. But if the basis was more about broader education and advocating in each one teach one principle, I'd be less skeptical. That's really interesting and reminds me of Joe, you talking about the kind of individual performance practices, linking into that as well, the one-on-one performances. Hazel's come in saying, could I know a little more about how you've connected with those who could not connect in the digital media or did not have access were involved, how those were involved? I wonder, is the concept of the global village completely utopian? Can we include folk on low-income people in the applied arts and politics of our society? Can we comment on that quickly, Malaika, whilst we've got a bit more time?
Yeah, absolutely. Just briefly, in terms of that, we the venues really helped us with that. So these were people who we worked with Age UK as well. We kind of worked directly with community groups. So these people were not completely disconnected from their community, their society. They weren't completely isolated, but they, we accessed them by phone call, by the fact that they were already connected to local groups that knew of them and thought they might want to take part. So that's kind of how we reach them. Just really quickly on that Cumbria Citizens jury, I was actually going to work on that project and bring in like arts-based methods. But I think that citizens' juries are really interesting because they use a process of sortition. I would love to do a theatre show that used a process of sortition. I think that would be really exciting of like people being randomly selected from, and it's like a really rigorous process that they go through to end up on those juries. And it is kind of representative in an interesting way. But yeah, I feel like rather than instead and like the teach one, learn one principle and citizens juries, right? Like not or and, I'd say for that. And just really quick, I want to come back to something that Joe said quickly, which was to do with the modes of engagement and what the rules of the game are. And there was a really interesting piece by a European practitioner called Sarah Van He, and I'll put her name in the chat, with a piece that she did called Lecture for Everyone, which she did like across Europe in like lots of different languages, where she just would like infiltrate meetings that were going on and do this like 10-minute long lecture performance. It was kind of about like utopianism and how we want the world to be, and aren't things shit, but couldn't they be better? And she would like infiltrate like board meetings. She went into some university lectures. She just like she went into like lots of local council meetings as well, where she just like kind of overtook the proceedings. But in terms of disrupting how we normally do democracy, her work is really interesting for that, like direct action as performance. We're blurring those lines for sure.
Amazing. Just purely in interest of time, we've only got 5 minutes, and we have spoken about this a lot, but I just wanted just to address it directly. Could you each, Aurelien and Malaika, just maybe talk to us about a couple of minutes about each other's perspectives on this work and what you see as the connections, overlaps, and possible. Are there any kind of, even through this discussion or discussion you had before tonight, spaces or terms of collaboration between political science, other wider humanities, and participatory theatre? And we can think utopian as well. I encourage us to.
Should I, or do you want to go first? Yeah. No, I think there are. I mean, I think there are plenty of ways. I mean, from kind of like if I think back to our conversation, like our first conversation, we started on very kind of practical ways based on your questions, which I think would be fascinating avenues of discussion, of research and things like that. But I think there are more important ones, which I think have come out maybe more clearly in the discussion we've had today in the past hour and a half about the meaning of democracy and what democracy means, and the limits we impose on ourselves about what democracy means, what debate means, what discussion means, and all of these things. And I think, if we accept that a lot of the kind of the system of meanings that we live in and that we consider as democracy, as liberalism, and as the world around us are constructed, we can challenge them better through various approaches, right? And I think, I study discourse, for example, and I study the construction of the people, but at the same time, that's what Malaika does in her work as well. She constructs a people. And none of these are exhausted or exhaustive to some extent, but it shows, again, contingency, I think, and it shows possibilities. So from my point of view, it's like, listening to Malaika talk about her work and her projects, and you guys as well, obviously, and what you've been doing as well in terms of participatory theatre and so on. I think it opens up a lot of kind of new avenues, because a lot of what you've been talking about as well resonates to the kind of the understanding of democracy I try to apply in my own work. When I work a lot, for example, on Jacques Rancière, Alain Badiou. I mean, I've done work on Freire as well, on education and emancipatory education, and all of this kind of speaks to that, this idea that, Jacques Rancière, for example, his understanding of democracy is that the only, like the most basic rule of democracy is that the people in power should never be the ones who want to be in power. And therefore, the only way that you can have a democracy is by the drawing of lots, by having people who are completely randomly selected, and to make sure that anyone who's randomly selected doesn't want to be in power, actually, which I think is a very nice way to think about it. And, people think about it, but that's crazy. Why should we have that? And it's like, yeah, but look at who we have leading us at the moment, right? Are they competent?
Oh, it's great.
Are they honest?
It's great. battling
Right.
for Britain.
So
Yeah.
would it be really worse if it was just randomly chosen people? I'm not sure, right? So let's try it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, I really like that. Like picking up maybe there that the overlaps and like the rooms for collaboration are kind of pushing beyond what like the status quo is, and saying like, if we didn't have these assumptions holding us back, like what could we do? Like I feel like there's so many beginnings of stories like from even your presentation and your work, like that could be drawn into like a theatrical mode of expression. I was really like interested in that the different ways like the people have been weaponized, and I think that we like that idea that like the people are a body that we can be listened to and can legitimize things as well is really fascinating. Like I'd love to kind of go further down that line and think about how that also relates to like potentially the problematic things in the creation of a people within our work. Like we're creating maybe like an in crowd, and is there a risk there of also having an us and them, and using that and like actually problematizing our work, and using your research to do that, I think would be a really fascinating thing.
Oh, great! So exciting.
That
is such an exciting way to end. And I noticed that there is just a question sort of hovering. I think we did address it from Pedro. Yes, we did. About how does faith need to change? Well, I think that's kind of, we've diagnosed the problem nicely, I think, in that last exchange. So that's an open question. So I think we'll end it there, Tom. That's okay. I want to thank our absolutely astounding panel. Brilliant discussion. We could talk for a lot longer. But just to say to people watching in the chat now, I've put a link both to the YouTube video of the first webinar. This one will go up as well soon, and also a link to our next event, which is the last in this series, which is on June 14th, and we're looking there explicitly at gaming and theatre gameplay. So this has been such a fantastic chat. Thanks everyone for your contributions. I can see some thank yous coming in now. And thank you, Tom. And I look forward to, so do follow us on Twitter and spread the word. So if we could just give our panel a clap, electronic clap, it could just be me and you, Tom. Yeah. But it's a theatre webinar, so we have to do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone. Have a good evening. I'm going to end the webinar now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Take care.
Bye.